Hi, so I'm Marilyn Selwood, Service Associate for the Mankind Initiative. I've been working in domestic abuse for almost 20 years. I'm a survivor of domestic abuse. I set up a survivor group. I then worked as an IDVA, so an independent domestic violence advisor, supporting high-risk male and female victims within the community. I then became an integrated service manager, so managing refuges, safe houses, victims services, and also perpetrator programs within the County of Somerset. I joined Mankind about 3.5 years ago as a service associate, putting the service through accreditation and providing training and consultation both locally and nationally throughout the UK. So Mankind are the first British charity set up in 2001 to support male victims and their families, run by both men and women. We're a very small charity, just 4 paid members of staff, with our chairman and our charity manager being volunteers. So we deliver a broad spectrum of services from our base in Somerset. So we have direct services, a national helpline that runs Monday to Friday, 10 till 4, and that's totally funded by grants and donations. We have no government funding whatsoever. And we also offer local drop-in to men in the area who are unable to access commission services or don't feel comfortable accessing commission services. So they can come and see us, obviously not in these times of COVID, but normally they can come and see us and we can offer them support on a one-to-one basis. We also deliver advocacy through trainings and presentations such as this. So where we go out and support services such as the police, housing associations, various other agencies and organisations to open their eyes and raise their awareness of the additional barriers that men face, and also other domestic abuse services. So services that are wanting to expand to introduce men into their service, or who are setting up a new service for male victims. We have an annual conference held in November every year. This year we plan to be in York, but actually obviously that's not been able to go ahead. So we have a virtual conference, and if you look on our website, there are still a few tickets left. We have a website with about 100,000 users per year, and the majority of those users are victims, survivors and their families who are wanting to look for resources or for services in their area, and to sort of try and confirm, I think, actually what they're experiencing is domestic abuse. We deliver specialist training for the armed forces. So for the last 2.5 years, I've been delivering training to the Army, Navy, Royal Marines and the RAF in the UK and overseas, to welfare staff predominantly, but also to military police, medical staff, padres, anyone who would come into contact with a male victim. We have the Male Domestic Abuse Network portal for professionals, which I'm going to talk to you a little bit about in more detail later on in the presentation. And we also sit on various statutory boards and advisory positions, both locally and nationally. So we work with the CPS, the National Institute of Clinical Excellence, the ONS. So for the first time in 2018, we were invited by the Office of National Statistics to present or submit our statistics so that they could add them in to their existing figures, and hopefully this will raise awareness for men in the future by sort of getting more notoriety around the men who actually experience domestic abuse. We sit on various different domestic abuse forums, again, both locally in Somerset and nationally. We work closely with the Home Office, so giving input on the DA bill, which is passing through Parliament at the moment, and also in advisory positions, so things like the domestic abuse protection orders and that type of stuff. And KIDAS, the Employers Initiative for Domestic Abuse, so we were one of the founding members of KIDAS, and KIDAS is set up to support employers to make sure that they have the right policies and procedures in place to recognise domestic abuse, not only with the people they're providing support to or working with, but also for their employees, and whether that's as victims or perpetrators. So who can it happen to? So domestic abuse can happen to anybody. It doesn't matter what race, religion, where you come from, whatever walk of life you're in, it can happen to absolutely anyone. I've popped prisoner on the bottom right-hand side of that slide. And that's because I've been doing some work recently with a prison resettlement service, and it's been widely recognised that a lot of male prisoners who are facing release are concerned about having to go back to a home where abuse has happened, or to have to get back and rely on parents who have been abusive to them in the past, and they want to break that cycle. So it's important that we recognise that even though they're prisoners, actually they are victims or can be victims in their own right. So the data sources throughout this presentation are provided from the ONS, the police, and also our Mankind Helpline. So it's a combination of statistics from the Police National Crime Survey in England and Wales, and the Office of National Statistics data that they collate on a regular basis, and also our helpline numbers. So it's recognised that in 2018-19, 786,000 men experienced domestic abuse. So for every 3 victims of abuse, 2 will be female and 1 will be male. And I think that's a really important figure to remember as we go through the presentation and we look at the provision that's out there for men that certainly doesn't equate to that. So it's really important that we recognise this isn't a minority. Actually, 1/3 of all domestic abuse victims are males. There's no clear pattern regarding their occupation. So we know that actually it doesn't matter what walk of life you're in or what career path you're on, actually anybody can be a victim. And I've popped the links to these statistics at the bottom of the page if you're interested. So we know that men and women who are disabled are more likely to be a victim of partner abuse than those who are not disabled. So we know that 4.3% of men with a long-term illness or disability were victims of partner abuse in 2018-19, and which is a much higher figure than those without any long-term illness or disability. We also recognise that the highest region for partner abuse for both men and women, again, in 2018-19 was the West Midlands, with men at 4.2% and women at 6.4%. And we also know that in that same year, 2018-19, domestic stalking by a partner or ex-partner was experienced by 0.6% of men. And although that figure sounds very small, that equates to 111,000. That's an awful lot of men who were stalked in that particular year. And then since the age of 16, so during their adult lifetime, 3% of men, so 621,000 men reported experiencing some form of stalking in their lifetime. So that's for every 4 victims, 3 will be female and 1 will be male. So again, not a minority. And the percentage of gay or bisexual men who suffered partner abuse is greater than those in heterosexual relationships. And again, this applies for women in same-sex relationships. And the number of women convicted of perpetrating domestic abuse has increased 6-fold since 2004/5. So a lot more recognition out there that women can be perpetrators too. So the majority of men who are experiencing abuse are experiencing that from a partner or an ex-partner. So this brings us to the power and control wheel. So the power and control wheel, the generic power and control wheel doesn't look like this. So we've provided a simplified version. So the power and control wheel was designed by an organisation called Duluth in the 1980s in Minnesota. And it was a gendered model and remains a gendered model. And there's been a lot of controversy about that and people not necessarily thinking it's applicable to men as victims. But actually, if you take the gender away, the model is still very valuable. And this tool in particular is valuable when working frontline with men, helping them recognise what's going on and the different types of abuse. And very often they don't even recognise some of the stuff that's happening to be abusive. So it's a really valuable tool to use and to help victims understand their experiences and how they can move on. So you can Google the power and control wheel, and there's about 120, I think, now adapted versions of the power and control wheel. So things such as people with learning disabilities, people in the military, the impact of domestic abuse on children are all put into an adapted version of the generic power and control wheel. And it still does have its value as a frontline working tool. But within Mankind, we use one that has no gender. So instead of saying him or her, or it says them or they throughout. So power and control is what domestic abuse is. It's at the core of every abusive situation. So it's where the abuser or the partner controls and coerces their victim, exerting power over them and stripping them of their identity and their independence. So it's important to recognise that all victims can suffer different types of abuse, whether that's physical, verbal, isolation, emotional abuse, financial, sexual abuse, threats, use of children, stalking, etc. Parental alienation, false allegations are all in there. However, it's important also to recognise that both men and women can experience differing levels of these behaviours and often in different ways. So when we carry on looking at the cycle of abuse, with power and control sat right at the middle, this cycle that goes round, starting with the incident at the top, will carry on throughout that abusive relationship. And the relationship doesn't necessarily have to be between a man and a woman or intimate partners. It can also be from family members. So where you have an adult child abusing an adult, a parent, or vice versa, or maybe siblings or extended family being abusive. So with the incident sitting at the top, this is the actual act of abuse. So this is where the act, the physical act, the psychological act, financial, sexual, whatever that may be, the incident of abuse sits there at the top and then goes on to a period of reconciliation. So during this period of reconciliation, there's some perceived respite for the victim, where maybe the perpetrator has been removed from the family home or has removed themselves. They'll make promises that it won't happen again, that they'll seek help. So try and make things better. And maybe provide things such as gifts and reassurances to the victim about what's happened. Then that goes on to a period of calm or perceived calm. So this is the head working stage, very much so. So this is where the perpetrator will try and blame the victim for what's happened. So if you didn't do this, this wouldn't have happened. Or if you did do this, this wouldn't have happened. You know these things will trigger me. You shouldn't have done that. You know that will cause me to react. So they'll transfer the blame onto the victim and cause a power shift there as to why that incident happened. It then goes on to a tension building phase. So this is where the perpetrator is escalating their abuse. The victim knows that something's going to happen, another incident is about to happen. They may not be sure when or what that might be, but they are waiting. They're walking on eggshells and they're very tense and anxious about what's about to happen. What can happen between that tension building stage and the incident stage is that the victim may provoke the perpetrator into committing that act of abuse so that they can get past that and back to that period of respite and reconciliation. And then on the outside, you'll see the increase in severity and frequency. So as that pattern goes on, the act will actually become more severe and this will become more frequent. And that is obviously on a very individual basis, depending on the longevity of the relationship and the intensity of the abuse. What's different for men as victims are these four things around the outside. So masculinity, public policy and story, societal belief systems, and lack of visible services. So masculinity. Strong stereotypes exist around what it means to be a man within our society. So some may believe that these are representations of hardwired differences between men and women, and others suggest that they are learned from the environment that we live in from a young age. So what happens to us as we're growing up through our childhood. And regardless where they come from, men and masculinity are often represented as being aggressive, independent, strong, stoic, and emotional, dominant, and particularly within relationships, and protective, particularly families. So we very much look to men within our society as providers and protectors. Because of these stereotyped or perceived stereotypes, male victims often don't understand or recognise that they can be a victim. They feel a sense of shame, embarrassment, and lack of pride. They feel they're not in control. They might ignore what's happening to them and try and deny it, not wanting to draw attention to their problems, minimising and trying to cope alone, not reaching out for support, and feel that they're not strong, resilient, or providing the security that's expected of them. They may see victimisation as a weakness and that they might be stigmatised for getting help. They certainly won't want to leave their children behind, and they'll probably feel very lonely, but they hide it quite well. When it comes to belief systems and societal outcomes, these stereotypes also affect men and influence the stereotypes about abuse. So the domestic abuse stereotype presents as perpetrated by men towards women, and this encourages thinking that men can't be victims, they need less help. The victimization is funny. So when we think of situations where a man's being abused in a public place, lots of people will find that quite humorous, and their response would be very different if it was a male being abusive to a female. Lots of people will ask what that person's done, what that man's done to deserve that. He must have done something to her for her to behave in that way. Whereas we wouldn't be looking to justify that behaviour if it was the other way around. Violence against a man is deemed to be more acceptable. Lots of people still believe that women can't be perpetrators, so there's a lot less provision within the UK for women as perpetrators compared to men as perpetrators, and certainly not comparative to the amount of victims that we have. Male victims are often told that it's just a domestic, to man up, and there's an expectation that they can tolerate it more. And gay, bisexual, transgender victims are not identified as victims of domestic abuse, and it's often seen as mutual abuse when people in same-sex relationships are seen to be in an abusive situation. Therefore, this leaves male victims feeling that they won't be believed by the friends, family, and professionals, that they may face ridicule from their male peers if they reach out or disclose. They'll be the ones accused of being abusive, so they're fearful of the system and reporting because they feel that actually those professionals will turn it around, that they are actually the abuser. They may feel actually that they're the only man to experience this and no other man has ever suffered domestic abuse. They may self-blame. They're obviously still fearful of losing contact with their children, and fear of the unknown. So they won't know where to go, what to do, what is available out there to help them. So these are some pictures of things that we found within society that have been products for sale. So on the left there, we've got an inflatable punch bag. This was for sale in 2017 for around £25 in a local pharmacy outlet, a national pharmacy outlet, and around 600 of them were sold before we became aware. Although the image isn't particularly good, what you'll see there is an inflatable punch bag with a clear wallet over the man's face, where you insert a photo of him, and then it says things like knee him here, kick him there. We wouldn't see something like this within society with a female image on there asking us to do the same. It wouldn't be, and rightfully so, acceptable. Then we've got the knife block depicting a male with knives all through his body, a t-shirt saying husband beater, a divorce cake or two divorce cakes depicting, one not so gory image, but one other quite gory image of a female killing a male. And although these are supposed to be funny, we wouldn't be seeing this the other way around, and it wouldn't be acceptable, and it shouldn't be this way either. However, there are some really, really good campaigns out there, some good communications. So these chaps are recycling operatives in the Manchester area who set up a campaign called #OpenUp. And their message was to say, no matter who you are, no matter what your gender, what your group or your class is within society, you can speak out about abusive relationships. And it's really important that we get that message out there. They are still continuing to deliver some really fantastic and important campaigns. So if you're interested in supporting them, then please do look them up at #OpenUp. And also this one, so Hertfordshire Domestic Abuse Helpline set up this really simple but really effective poster for their campaign advertising the helpline, saying 1 in 6 men, 1 in 4 women, and all of their children are affected by domestic abuse. And if you're looking to set up a campaign within your organisation, something like this is really simple, really effective and inclusive. So when it comes to public policy and disclosure, the UK law is defined as gender neutral, but policymakers obviously often portray abuse as gendered, and this can lead to some issues around lack of inclusion within those policies, funding. So primarily for female refugees, there are around 4,500, nearly 5,000 bed spaces for female victims, and just 204 bed spaces for men within the UK, with only 40 of those dedicated spaces being solely for men, the rest being accessible by men or women. And whilst we don't want to take anything away from female victims and survivors, it's absolutely imperative that they get the support that they deserve. The same should apply for male victims too. There's a lack of male victim friendly services and information on the ground. So when it comes to specialist DV services, housing, campaigns within surgeries, accessibility to courts, there's still very much a void there when it comes to support for men. Still some pockets of disbelief when men disclose. People don't always recognise that that can happen to them and will try and minimise it. And a lack of male victim focused training for frontline staff and employees. So here's a map I made earlier this year about the refuges and safe houses for men within the UK. So there are currently just 37 organisations offering refuge or safe house accommodation across the country. And as I said, just 204 bed spaces. And what you will also see from this map, that in London, the most highly populated area of our country, there is very, very little provision. In fact, nothing for men currently. There is just one temporary accommodation facility for men in London that's funded with the COVID funding, but there's no suggestion that this temporary refuge will continue when the pandemic ends. So how can you find out about these services? How can you find out about what's available to men? So Mankind have set up the MDAM portal, Male Domestic Abuse Network portal. This is solely for professionals and practitioners that are working with men who are experiencing domestic abuse and supporting them. And you can register via our website or go to mdan.org.uk, and we have a list of directory of services within that portal. And you can filter that down by specialism or by area. And you can also access an additional area of the portal that provides details about refuges and safe houses and how you can make contact with them and also their availability. Earlier this year, I've also been working with the Rail Distribution Group nationally to support men to get free travel via the train into a place of safety. This is now being taken over by Respect, and hopefully the Rail Distribution Group will be giving you more information about that soon. And when it comes to COVID, so this year has been a really unique year for us all and very strange and testing times. During the pandemic, we've held regular Zoom meetings with practitioners and other service providers. We know that there's been an increase of calls to our service of around 35 to 40% on helplines, including ours. We also know that victims have been accessing online services such as websites and chat rooms, and we've actually seen an increase of around 160% in visits to our website. Men are reporting issues around breaches of child arrangement orders, but also we've seen a massive increase of men experiencing other issues such as mental health and other forms of abuse, but not being able to access their usual services. So more people are coming through with issues that aren't necessarily domestic abuse related because their normal access services aren't available. So what can you do? What can you do to support a male victim of domestic abuse? And this is applicable to females as well. So it's important that we believe and reassure them as a victim, that we believe everything they say and not judge them, and be patient when they're talking to us. Focus on supporting them and building their self-confidence, encourage them to seek help, signpost and refer them to local sources of support, but also national services such as Karma Nirvana for honour-based crime or victims of crime, and also people like Gallup for the LGBTQ+ community. It's important that you discuss and be clear about whether it's confidential and what your policies are within your organisation. But you must remember, it's likely that you're the first person they've ever reached out to, and it's important for you to let them know that your service and yourself is male victim friendly, and that they won't necessarily believe they are a victim, so they will need some reassurance around that. If nothing from this presentation today, it's important that you take away these three things: to recognise, to respond, and to record. And this will hopefully keep your victim and yourself safe. It's important under the government domestic abuse definition of being gender neutral that male and females are equal under the Law, Guidance and Equalities Act. So ask yourself, do I give the same level of support to a man or a woman with the same level of risk and need? You can also ask that of your organisation and the people around you. A message for our survivors, whether that's yourself or someone you're working with, someone within your family or your friendship group. You are not to blame, you are not weak, and you aren't alone. Thank you for taking the time to listen to my presentation today. My name is Marilyn Selwood, Service Associate at Mankind Initiative, and these are my contact details. Thank you.